"Sir, the service entrance is around the corner," the man said with a grin loud enough for half the room to hear, and the laughter that followed rolled across the polished marble floor like it belonged there. At exactly 7:12 p.m., beneath crystal chandeliers and walls lined with portraits of business legends, the Sterling Private Members Club buzzed with quiet confidence, expensive conversations, and the certainty that everyone inside knew exactly where they belonged. Then Nathaniel Brooks walked through the front entrance alone. He wore dark jeans, polished brown shoes, a navy sport coat without a tie, and carried nothing but a slim leather portfolio. There was no luxury watch flashing beneath the lights, no security detail, no assistant rushing ahead to announce his arrival. He looked like a successful professional finishing an ordinary workday, not the chief executive officer of one of the fastest-growing investment firms in America. The laughter grew louder. A silver-haired member holding a crystal glass leaned toward his companions and said, "Guess somebody wandered in from the wrong building." Another answered, "Maybe tonight they're giving tours." Smiles spread around the foyer. Even people who hadn't heard the first joke laughed anyway, eager to belong to the crowd rather than question it. Nathaniel stopped only long enough to admire the enormous oil painting above the grand staircase. His expression never changed. He had seen rooms like this before. Rooms where expensive furniture often made people believe they had purchased wisdom along with membership. He approached the reception desk with measured steps, his posture calm, his voice steady. "Good evening, Nathaniel Brooks. I believe I'm expected." The receptionist hesitated before glancing at the reservation screen, then looked back at him with uncertainty shaped more by assumption than evidence. Before she could answer, a club manager in a tailored charcoal suit appeared beside her, wearing the polished smile reserved for uncomfortable situations. "Good evening, sir. Are you certain you're in the right place? Tonight's gathering is invitation only." Nathaniel nodded once. "That's correct." The manager waited for more, almost expecting an explanation that never came. Around them conversations slowed. Heads turned. One guest quietly raised a phone, pretending to check messages while angling the camera toward the entrance. Another whispered, "This should be interesting." Nathaniel neither acknowledged the whispers nor defended himself. He simply stood with the quiet patience of someone who understood that truth never became stronger because it was spoken louder. Long before Brooks Capital appeared on magazine covers, long before television interviews and conference stages, he had learned that prejudice usually announced itself before introductions ever could. It rarely asked questions. It preferred conclusions. Somewhere across the room, a young concierge watched the exchange with growing unease. She couldn't explain why, but something about the stranger's confidence refused to match the story everyone else had already decided to believe. While the room kept laughing, Nathaniel Brooks remained perfectly still, and without realizing it, every person inside the Sterling Private Members Club had already begun taking a test none of them knew they were about to fail. The manager folded his hands neatly in front of him, maintaining the polished smile expected inside a place where reputation was treated like currency. "May I see your invitation, sir?" he asked, his tone courteous enough for appearances but distant enough to create a line between belonging and suspicion. Nathaniel Brooks reached into his portfolio and removed a cream-colored envelope embossed with the Sterling crest. He placed it gently on the reception desk without saying another word. The receptionist accepted it, glanced at the elegant lettering, then looked toward the manager instead of opening it. The hesitation lasted barely 2 seconds, but inside a room built on first impressions, 2 seconds were enough to shape an entire narrative. "There has to be some mistake," one member murmured behind them. "Nobody dresses like that for Founders Night." Another chuckled softly. "Maybe he borrowed someone else's invitation." The comments spread through the lobby faster than the music drifting from the ballroom. Guests who had never spoken to Nathaniel suddenly felt qualified to explain exactly who he could not possibly be. Every glance became another silent verdict. Every whisper strengthened the confidence of people who believed appearances never lied. Nathaniel remained still, his eyes calmly taking in the room. Massive windows overlooked the city skyline where thousands of lights reflected across the river. Waiters moved quietly between clusters of members carrying silver trays filled with sparkling water and carefully prepared appetizers. Conversations about acquisitions, venture capital, and charitable foundations continued around him as though dignity itself had become another exclusive benefit available only to those wearing the proper suit. The manager finally opened the envelope. His eyes scanned the elegant card inside before narrowing almost imperceptibly. Instead of reading it aloud, he quietly turned the card over, searching for some detail that might justify the conclusion he had already reached. "I am afraid I cannot verify this immediately," he said. "Would you mind waiting while we look into it?" Nathaniel gave a small nod. "Take all the time you need." His answer seemed to disappoint those hoping for an argument. There was no raised voice, no frustration, no attempt to convince strangers that he deserved respect. The silence unsettled them far more than anger would have. Near the grand staircase, a young concierge named Emily Carter watched everything unfold. Earlier that afternoon, she had helped organize the evening's guest registry. She remembered seeing one particular name highlighted with unusual instructions, but the conversation surrounding her made certainty difficult. She quietly walked toward the reception desk before stopping halfway. Something told her she should speak. Something else reminded her that questioning senior management rarely ended well inside the club. Meanwhile, another guest discreetly positioned his phone toward the lobby, pretending to answer a message while recording the encounter. "This will probably end up online," someone whispered with amusement. Nathaniel noticed the phone but said nothing. He had learned years ago that people often reach for cameras long before they reach for compassion. Across the room, laughter slowly gave way to curiosity. The evening no longer revolved around the celebration everyone had come to attend. Without realizing it, every conversation had shifted toward one quiet man standing patiently beside the reception desk. And every passing second made the room less certain that it understood exactly who Nathaniel Brooks really was. Emily Carter tried to ignore the uneasy feeling in her chest, but it refused to disappear. She looked once more toward the reception monitor, then toward the quiet man waiting without complaint. Every instinct told her something about the situation felt backward. Before she could step closer, the club manager calmly closed the invitation and slid it back across the polished desk. "I am afraid there is still a verification issue," he said with practiced professionalism. "Until we receive confirmation, I cannot allow you beyond the lobby." Nathaniel Brooks accepted the envelope without looking at it. "I understand," he replied. His calm answer echoed more loudly than any argument could have. Several members exchanged amused smiles. One older businessman adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket and laughed softly. "See? Even he knows he should not be here." Another added, "Confidence is not the same thing as belonging." The words drifted through the room like invisible walls, separating those who believed they belonged from the man they had already decided did not. A security supervisor standing near the entrance noticed the growing attention and quietly walked toward the reception desk. His posture remained respectful, but his presence alone changed the atmosphere. Guests stopped pretending they were not watching. Conversations faded into whispers. Crystal glasses rested motionless in carefully manicured hands. The entire lobby became a stage without anyone announcing a performance. "Good evening, sir," the supervisor said politely. "The manager has asked that you remain in the reception area while we verify your credentials." Nathaniel nodded once. "That is perfectly acceptable." The supervisor seemed almost surprised by the answer. He had expected resistance, perhaps embarrassment, maybe frustration. Instead, he found someone whose composure never shifted. It was the kind of confidence that did not depend on winning an argument. Across the lobby, a well-known venture capitalist named Charles Whitmore shook his head with theatrical disappointment. "This is exactly why standards matter," he declared loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Exclusive places stop being exclusive the moment people begin assuming invitations are optional. A few members laughed again. Others smiled simply because everyone else was smiling. Nathaniel briefly turned toward the speaker. His expression remained peaceful. He neither challenged the remark nor acknowledged the insult. He simply looked away, as though preserving his own dignity mattered far more than correcting someone else's assumptions. Emily finally gathered enough courage to approach the assistant receptionist standing behind the desk. Lowering her voice, she whispered, "I remember seeing the name Brooks this afternoon. I think there were special instructions attached to the reservation." The receptionist glanced nervously toward the manager before answering. Do not get involved. He already made his decision. Emily hesitated. She had worked at Sterling for almost 4 years. She understood the unwritten rules. Employees were expected to protect the club's image, not question those above them. Yet the longer she watched Nathaniel standing quietly beneath the chandeliers, the harder it became to convince herself that silence was the right choice. Near the fireplace, another guest discreetly lifted his phone and began recording from a different angle. "People are going to talk about this tomorrow," he whispered to his companion. His companion answered without taking his eyes off Nathaniel. "No, they are going to talk about it tonight." The laughter had become less certain now. Curiosity slowly replaced amusement. Something invisible had begun shifting beneath the polished surface of the evening, and although nobody could explain why, the confidence of the crowd was beginning to crack long before anyone important had entered the room. Emily Carter could no longer convince herself that remaining silent was the professional choice. She stepped carefully behind the reception desk, opened the digital guest registry once again, and searched for the evening's executive arrivals. Her fingers paused above the keyboard as a highlighted entry appeared exactly where she remembered it. Nathaniel Brooks. The line beneath the name contained a private notation she had noticed earlier that afternoon before helping prepare the welcome packets. Executive arrival. Founder acknowledgement upon entry. She stared at the screen for a moment, wondering if she had misunderstood it the first time. She had not. Her heartbeat quickened. Before she could speak, the manager noticed her expression. "Emily," he said quietly but firmly, "step away from the system." She hesitated. "Sir, I think there is additional information attached to his reservation." The manager barely glanced at the monitor before closing the window. "That will be handled internally. Please return to your station." His voice remained calm, but the message was unmistakable. "Do not interfere." Emily lowered her eyes and slowly stepped back, yet uncertainty followed her with every step. She had worked at Sterling long enough to recognize the difference between careful procedure and deliberate assumption. Tonight felt far closer to the second. Across the lobby, another unexpected observer had begun paying close attention. Harold Bennett, a retired United States Marine colonel and one of the club's oldest members, quietly watched Nathaniel from a leather chair near the fireplace. During decades of military service and years spent advising nonprofit leadership programs, he had learned that confidence rarely announced itself with expensive clothing. He studied the calm way Nathaniel stood, the patience in his posture, and the complete absence of defensiveness. Something about the scene reminded him of leaders he had trusted under impossible circumstances. Beside him sat Daniel Kim, a technology entrepreneur who had joined Sterling only months earlier. Daniel leaned closer and whispered, "Does any of this seem strange to you?" Harold nodded slowly. "Very strange. People who are pretending usually talk too much. That gentleman has barely spoken." Daniel looked toward the reception desk again. "Then why is everyone so certain he does not belong?" Harold answered without taking his eyes off Nathaniel. "Because crowds often confuse confidence with correctness." Their quiet conversation contrasted sharply with the whispers spreading across the lobby. Some guests continued smiling, but fewer were laughing now. Even those who believed the manager had acted appropriately found themselves watching Nathaniel longer than they intended. His silence refused to fit the role they had assigned him. Near the entrance, 2 younger members discussed the unfolding scene, while pretending to admire the artwork on the wall. "He still has not argued," one said. "Most people would have left by now," the other replied. "Or they would have demanded to speak with someone important." Nathaniel did neither. He simply waited, occasionally looking through the tall windows toward the city lights shimmering across the river as though time itself had never been his enemy. Emily looked once more at the closed registry, then back at Nathaniel. She understood the personal risk of speaking against senior leadership, yet another thought refused to leave her mind. If everyone inside the room remained silent simply because silence was safer, then the truth might never reach the people who needed it most. Without realizing it, the room had begun dividing itself into 2 groups. One still trusted appearances. The other had started questioning the judgment of the crowd. Neither side knew that the person capable of ending every doubt was already on the way. Nathaniel Brooks remained exactly where he was, hands resting lightly on the leather portfolio at his side, while the room quietly decided what kind of man he must be. The manager glanced toward the security supervisor and gave a subtle nod that did not escape the attention of the guests watching nearby. "Sir," the supervisor said with professional courtesy, "would you mind waiting closer to the entrance until this matter is resolved? We need to keep the reception area clear for arriving members." It was a simple request on the surface, but everyone understood its meaning. Nathaniel was being moved farther from the celebration and closer to the door. Without protest, he stepped a few feet toward the entrance. The distance was small, yet the symbolism filled the room. Charles Whitmore smiled with quiet satisfaction. "That seems more appropriate," he remarked to no one in particular. Another guest added, "Some people simply have to learn that exclusivity exists for a reason." A few uneasy laughs followed, though they sounded weaker than before. Emily Carter watched from behind the desk, unable to ignore the growing weight in her conscience. Harold Bennett slowly rose from his chair, studying the scene with narrowed eyes, while Daniel Kim folded his arms and continued observing in silence. Nathaniel looked through the glass doors toward the evening skyline. The reflection staring back at him carried memories that had never truly disappeared. 23 years earlier, he had stood outside another private club only a few miles away after graduating at the top of his business program. He had been invited by a mentor who believed talent deserved opportunity. Before he ever reached the front desk, a doorman had politely suggested that deliveries belonged around the back of the building. Nathaniel had explained that he was attending a networking dinner. The man had apologized without sounding sorry, and asked him to wait outside while someone verified his name. Through the windows he watched guests walk freely inside, laughing beneath elegant lights while he remained alone on the sidewalk. That night lasted less than 20 minutes, but the lesson stayed with him for decades. Success could purchase buildings, companies, and influence. It could not automatically erase assumptions. Instead of allowing that memory to harden him, he had made a quiet promise to himself. If he ever built organizations of his own, dignity would never depend on appearance. The memory faded as the present returned. Nathaniel inhaled slowly and relaxed his shoulders. His expression revealed neither resentment nor disappointment. The people surrounding him expected embarrassment. Instead, they found composure so steady that it slowly unsettled their confidence. Harold finally walked a few steps closer and spoke in a calm voice that carried only to Daniel. "I have spent most of my life evaluating character under pressure," he said. "The loudest person in the room is almost never the strongest." Daniel nodded. "Then why does everyone keep listening to the loud voices?" Harold answered quietly, "Because certainty is contagious even when it is wrong." Emily looked once more toward the closed guest registry, then toward the grand entrance. She checked the time. The evening's principal host was scheduled to arrive within minutes. Around the lobby, conversations grew shorter. Even those who still believed Nathaniel did not belong had stopped laughing altogether. An invisible tension settled beneath the crystal chandeliers, as though the building itself were holding its breath. No announcement had been made. No revelation had occurred. Yet somewhere beyond the front doors, the one person capable of changing every assumption inside the room had just stepped out of a waiting car. The sound of a luxury sedan pulling beneath the covered entrance barely reached the lobby, yet the effect was immediate. Valets outside straightened their jackets. The doorman stood taller. Conversations faded into polite silence almost by instinct. Every year, the founder arrived without fanfare, refusing dramatic introductions or flashing cameras. His reputation had never depended on spectacle. It depended on the people whose lives he had quietly changed over 4 decades. The heavy glass doors opened. Arthur Whitmore, 72 years old, silver-haired and carrying a simple walking cane more out of habit than necessity, stepped inside with the relaxed confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. Members smiled expectantly, preparing to greet him. Several board directors adjusted their jackets. Charles Whitmore immediately stepped forward, rehearsing the welcome he had been waiting all evening to deliver. The club manager hurried from behind the reception desk, wearing his most practiced smile. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore. Welcome." Arthur acknowledged none of them. His eyes slowly traveled across the grand lobby, passing crystal chandeliers, marble columns, and rows of distinguished members. The room grew quieter with every second. Then his gaze stopped. Nathaniel Brooks still stood near the entrance exactly where security had politely asked him to wait. Arthur's face changed instantly. His serious expression softened into genuine warmth. Without saying a single word to the executives already reaching out to greet him, he changed direction and began walking straight across the lobby. The manager froze. Charles lowered his hand halfway through his greeting. Emily felt her heart racing as she watched the founder ignore every familiar face in the room. Harold Bennett smiled faintly, almost as though he had expected something unexpected all along. Daniel Kim followed Arthur with his eyes, saying nothing. The polished marble floor seemed impossibly quiet as Arthur continued forward. Every measured step erased another assumption that had filled the room only moments earlier. Guests instinctively moved aside, creating an open path no one had been asked to make. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt enormous. Nathaniel noticed Arthur approaching and offered a respectful smile. He remained exactly where he was, making no effort to close the distance. Arthur stopped directly in front of him. For a brief moment neither man spoke. Then the founder extended both hands instead of one, and clasped Nathaniel's hand with unmistakable affection. "Nathaniel," Arthur said warmly, his voice carrying naturally through the silent lobby, "you made it. I was beginning to wonder if traffic had delayed you." Nathaniel smiled. "I arrived on time. The evening has simply been educational." Arthur looked into his eyes for only a second before understanding that sentence carried far more meaning than it appeared to. He glanced around the room, noticing the uncertain expressions, the security supervisor standing nearby, the unopened conversations frozen across the lobby, and the club manager whose confident posture had quietly disappeared. Arthur released a slow breath. "I see," he replied calmly. His tone never rose, yet the air inside Sterling seemed to change direction. Emily looked toward the manager, who had turned noticeably pale. Charles Whitmore stared at Nathaniel as though seeing him for the very first time. Several guests slowly lowered their phones without realizing they had been recording. Arthur rested a reassuring hand on Nathaniel's shoulder and smiled once more. "Come with me," he said. "There are a great many people inside who have been looking forward to meeting the man who helped shape tonight's future." Arthur Whitmore kept his hand on Nathaniel Brooks's shoulder as they turned toward the center of the lobby, but after only a few steps he stopped and slowly faced the gathering of members. No one spoke. The silence carried far more weight than the laughter that had filled the room only minutes earlier. Arthur looked from face to face with calm disappointment rather than anger. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we continue with tonight's celebration, there is someone every one of you should know." Every eye shifted toward Nathaniel. Charles Whitmore instinctively straightened his jacket again, hoping the founder's words would somehow restore the confidence that had quietly slipped away. The manager stood motionless beside the reception desk. Emily Carter watched without blinking. Harold Bennett folded his hands behind his back, while Daniel Kim quietly smiled to himself as the pieces finally began fitting together. Arthur continued, "For the past 3 years, many of the innovations this club has proudly supported have existed because one man believed they deserved a chance before anyone else did." A wave of confusion spread through the room. Arthur turned toward Nathaniel with unmistakable respect. Nathaniel Brooks did not simply attend tonight as a guest. He is the strategic investor whose vision helped launch the leadership initiative we are honoring this evening. Long before most people here even heard about the program, he believed in it. He funded it. He strengthened it. Without his partnership, tonight would not even exist. A quiet gasp moved across the lobby. Charles felt the color leave his face. Several members who had laughed earlier exchanged nervous glances, suddenly remembering every careless word they had spoken. Arthur looked back toward the crowd. "Some of you judged him before learning his name. Some of you decided who belonged here before asking a single question. That disappoints me far more than you may realize." Nathaniel remained completely still beside him. His expression never changed. There was no satisfaction in proving anyone wrong. No trace of triumph crossed his face. Arthur smiled gently at him before speaking again. "Nathaniel has spent his career opening doors for entrepreneurs who were overlooked because they did not fit someone else's expectations. I invited him here because character deserves recognition, Not because titles impress me. The founder paused, allowing every sentence to settle into the room. The greatest mistake any exclusive institution can make is believing exclusivity should be measured by appearance instead of integrity. The words landed with quiet force. The manager lowered his eyes. Even the security supervisor seemed visibly uncomfortable, replaying the evening in his mind. Emily remembered the note she had seen in the guest registry and silently wished she had trusted her instincts sooner. Harold finally nodded with quiet approval. Daniel whispered under his breath, "That is leadership." Arthur turned once more toward Nathaniel and smiled warmly. "My friend, I apologize that your welcome was delayed." Nathaniel answered with the same calm that had carried him through the entire evening. "The welcome was delayed," he said softly, "but the truth arrived exactly when it needed to." Arthur laughed quietly before addressing the room one final time. "Remember this moment well. You did not laugh at a stranger tonight. You laughed at a man whose generosity has created opportunities for people many of you will never meet. The question is not whether Nathaniel belongs here. The question every one of us should ask is whether we have earned the privilege of standing beside someone like him." The silence that followed was complete, and for the first time that evening, no one in the Sterling lobby questioned where Nathaniel Brooks belonged. No one moved. The silence settled over the marble lobby with a weight that no speech could have created on its own. Only minutes earlier the room had been filled with quiet laughter, confident assumptions, and polished conversations about leadership. Now every polished shoe seemed rooted to the floor. Charles Whitmore lowered his eyes first. The confidence that had carried his jokes had disappeared without leaving a trace. He slowly walked toward Nathaniel Brooks, cleared his throat, and extended a hesitant hand. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "I owe you an apology. I judged you before I knew anything about you." Nathaniel looked at the offered hand for only a moment before accepting it with quiet courtesy. "Thank you," he replied. "Acknowledging a mistake always requires more courage than making one." Charles nodded silently and stepped aside. The manager remained frozen behind the reception desk. Every decision he had made throughout the evening replayed in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. Arthur Whitmore turned toward him without raising his voice. "Tell me something," he asked calmly. "At what point did anyone verify Mr. Brooks's invitation before deciding he did not belong?" The manager searched for an answer that refused to come. We were attempting to follow procedure." Arthur shook his head gently. "Procedure begins with facts. Assumptions begin with appearances. Those are not the same thing." The words landed harder than any public rebuke. Emily Carter quietly looked down, unsure whether she should feel relieved or guilty. Arthur noticed her standing near the reception desk. "Emily," he said kindly, "you tried to speak, did you not?" She nodded carefully. "I remembered seeing Mr. Brooks's name in the registry. I should have trusted what I saw." Arthur smiled. Integrity often begins with a quiet voice that chooses to speak even when it is uncomfortable. Do not lose that. Emily smiled for the first time all evening. Nearby, the security supervisor stepped toward Nathaniel with genuine sincerity. "Sir, I apologize for asking you to wait near the entrance. I believed I was helping maintain order." Nathaniel answered with the same steady calm that had never left him. "You treated me respectfully. I appreciate that. We all make decisions with the information we believe we have." The supervisor exhaled, visibly grateful. Around the lobby, members slowly lowered their phones. Several quietly deleted the videos they had recorded only moments earlier. The story no longer felt entertaining. It felt personal. Harold Bennett walked toward Nathaniel and extended his hand. "I spent 30 years teaching young officers that character reveals itself under pressure," he said. "Tonight you reminded me that lesson never grows old." Nathaniel smiled warmly. "Thank you, Colonel." Daniel Kim joined them and laughed softly. "I came here expecting a networking event. Instead, I received one of the best leadership lessons I have ever witnessed." Arthur looked around the room one final time before speaking again. "Tonight is not about embarrassment," he said. "It is about reflection. If we leave here protecting our pride instead of examining our judgment, then this evening has taught us nothing." No one argued. No one attempted to defend what had happened. Beneath the crystal chandeliers, surrounded by wealth, influence, and accomplishment, the most valuable thing anyone possessed at that moment was the willingness to admit they had been wrong, and Nathaniel Brooks accepted every sincere apology with the same quiet dignity he had carried into the building long before anyone recognized his name. Nathaniel Brooks and Arthur Whitmore walked side by side through the open ballroom doors as every conversation inside came to a respectful stop. Hundreds of members turned toward them, but this time the room was not filled with curiosity. It was filled with understanding. Arthur stepped to the podium first. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "before tonight's program begins, I would like to recognize a leader whose greatest achievements will never fit on a balance sheet." He turned toward Nathaniel with a smile that reflected years of mutual respect. Success built his reputation. Character built everything that came before it. The room answered with genuine applause that grew stronger with every passing second. Nathaniel accepted neither the attention nor the praise as though either belonged to him alone. He simply thanked Arthur with a nod before stepping to the podium. The applause slowly faded until the ballroom became completely still. Nathaniel looked across the audience, recognizing many of the same faces that had quietly judged him less than an hour earlier. Yet there was no bitterness in his expression, only calm. "When I walked into this building tonight," he began, "I had the same invitation, the same experience, and the same purpose that I carried when I parked my car outside. The only thing that changed was what people believed about me." No one looked away. "Many years ago," he continued, "I thought success would protect me from moments like this. I believed that hard work, education, and achievement would eventually speak loudly enough that assumptions would disappear. I was wrong. Success may change your address, but it does not automatically change someone else's expectations." The room remained silent. Nathaniel rested both hands lightly on the podium. "That realization could have made me angry. Instead, it made me intentional. Every company I have built, every investment I have made, and every opportunity one have supported has been guided by one simple belief. People deserve to be seen before they are judged." Emily Carter felt her eyes grow misty as she listened. Harold Bennett quietly smiled. Daniel Kim nodded with thoughtful admiration. Even the manager stood near the back of the ballroom listening more carefully than he had listened to anyone in years. Nathaniel looked toward Arthur before continuing. "The reason I accepted tonight's invitation was never to receive recognition. It was to stand beside people who claim to value leadership. Leadership begins long before boardrooms, titles, or applause. It begins in ordinary moments when nobody believes anyone important is watching." He paused for only a heartbeat before delivering his final thought. "The easiest thing in the world is to recognize value after someone else introduces it. The harder choice, and the one that defines real character, is to recognize dignity before credentials ever have the chance to speak." The ballroom stood in complete silence for several seconds. Then Harold Bennett slowly rose to his feet and began applauding. Daniel stood beside him. Emily followed. One by one, every member in the ballroom rose until the entire room was standing. The applause no longer celebrated wealth, influence, or status. It honored humility, restraint, and truth. Arthur quietly leaned toward Nathaniel and said, "I hope they would remember your accomplishments." Nathaniel smiled gently as he looked across the room. "If they remember anything," he replied, "I hope they remember this instead. Respect should never arrive after recognition. It should arrive the moment another human being walks through the door."